19th of September 2025. Kind of hard to believe, but it's true. And the reason I mentioned the day too is in case you're watching this in the future, for future reference, because it is relevant. I'm going to talk to you about stuff as I do in this video, and the particular stuff in this video is about Bitcoin and Dixie. Hopefully, I won't wander off too much, as I sometimes do, into other topics. Yeah, so is the real Dixie Chicken? What does that mean? What does that mean? Well, Bitcoin is currently not a stable coin in the traditional sense. It is very volatile. The whole idea of it is to be an escape hatch for people from the traditional financial system. So, at the moment, since it is very volatile, it is not a stable coin. That said, there are countries on Earth where the local currency is more volatile in a sense, or can have, or at least can have greater losses while there are negative swings, usually more than positive, than Bitcoin. Venezuela, for example, right after their currency crashed, it was safer to be in Bitcoin even when Bitcoin's price was dropping significantly, sometimes even up to 80%, than it was to be in Venezuela's currency, which tumbled massively for a long time. Bitcoin is not yet a stable currency, and probably maybe never will be, but it will probably take a long time to get there if it ever does. That said, it probably can, may, even will become at least a world reserve currency, if not the world reserve currency at some point. Now, how can that be? Well, can there be more than one world reserve currency? Of course, there can be more than one world reserve currency. If the nations of the world decide to adopt more than one currency to do exchanges of critical resources in, for example, oil, right? If, let's say, half the nations on Earth said, "Yeah, we're gonna do transactions of Bitcoin in for oil, or we might use dollars, we might use both, doesn't matter. Heck, we'll throw in the euro in there too, right? And they all become global reserve currencies, right? There's a very high probability that at some point, globally, Bitcoin will be seen as a world reserve currency. Again, even if it doesn't replace the dollar fully, and it could, in theory, replace the dollar fully, but that doesn't mean it will. There's a lot that has to happen between now and the time that would happen, right? It's not like you push a button right now, and all of a sudden, poof! Immediately, the dollar, has been replaced by the Bitcoin. That's not reality. That's not how that happens. It takes a lot of mainlining Bitcoin into the global pipeline across all supply chains, across all financial systems, across all governments. It's a long road to hoe between now and the time Bitcoin becomes a quote unquote stable coin or a world reserve currency of any kind. Now, again, could it happen? Could Bitcoin become a global reserve currency? The answer is absolutely 100% yes, it could. It is a possibility. Right? That was always a possibility since its inception. It just seemed more distant at its inception because time-wise it was more distant. But now we're getting closer to that. Does that mean it's going to happen in the next 5 to 10 years? No, it could take 30, 40, 50 years. It could take, we don't know how long. Again, maybe it never happens, but it could. There is an increasing probability that it will. If you just look at the fact of how all the finance is going, look at what financial systems are doing. Are they moving away from Bitcoin and crypto, or are they moving towards Bitcoin and crypto? The answer is very obvious. They're moving towards it. Right? That's why you have Bitcoin ETFs. That's why you have Ethereum ETFs. That's why you have other ETFs lining up to be real. That's why you have all these different financial systems adjusting to doing accounting with Bitcoin and Satoshis. right? These are real things. And it's, you can sit there if you're an anti-crypto person, it's a Ponzi scheme and whatever. Sure, fine. But if the entire financial system is built on it, and there's actual trade going on between people using what you call a Ponzi scheme, then it's not so much a Ponzi scheme, is it? Because if people are actually doing business with it, if they're actually conducting transactions with it, what kind of Ponzi scheme is that? A Ponzi scheme is where you're waiting to sell your goods to the next greater fool, right? Well, if people aren't selling their uh, Bitcoin for nothing, if they're actually using it to trade for goods and services, then it's not a Ponzi scheme, right? It's not. I mean, you can call it that, but it isn't, because they're not just using it to sell to the next greater fool. They're actually trading it for goods and services. Now, you might say, but nobody uses their Bitcoin to buy goods and services. But that's just not true. Now, it is a very small amount of people relative to the number of people on Earth that pay for things in Bitcoin. But there are people who pay for things in Bitcoin. And there's a lot of people who buy Bitcoin every day, which means somebody's selling it to them. And there's a lot of people that are selling Bitcoin every day, which means somebody's buying it from them. And you might say, yeah, but most of that is through trading exchanges. What good is that? Well, I'll tell you what good that is. That is a significant Kickstarter for any new market, right, is to have an exchange. And there are many exchanges across the world where people buy and sell Bitcoin all day. Now, does that mean necessarily the people that are buying and selling the Bitcoin all day, every day, are actually helping foment a new financial reality with Bitcoin as the driving force? Well, you might expect me to say, well, not really, but actually, yes. Right? Don't kid yourself. Those very particular trading exchanges are, in fact, the driving force that are causing Bitcoin to be not just a household name, but actually a significant force in finance and economics around the world. Why do I allow myself to say that? Well, just because factually it's true. Factually, there's a lot of action of buying and selling happening on those exchanges. Sure, at times there's more buying than at other times, or selling than at other times. And at times there's more trading happening than at other times. That's normal. But in general, that growth is continuing. And for now, anyway, while there still remains some modest number of Bitcoins on the exchanges, right? Anywhere from 700,000 or 500,000 to upwards of 2 million, depending on how you count the coins on the exchanges and whether or not they're actually available for trading, etc. Right? There's not that many. Excuse me. There's not that many coins on the exchanges compared to how much Bitcoin there actually is. Right? There's more than 19 million of them that have been mined. Right? And there's only 21 million total. And there's only at most a couple million on the exchanges, which means it's like, barely more than 10% of the coins are available on the exchanges, and they're not even all available because most of the coins on the exchanges are actually locked up. What do I mean by locked up? I mean they're not available for trade, right? They are in wallets that are not trading. They're in wallets that are just holding them on their exchanges, right? Because they haven't learned the lesson yet, not your keys, not your crypto. So they might leave even large stacks on an exchange because they trust the exchange more than themselves, which is very telling about the state of humanity. And there is a logic to it. It's why you would trust an exchange more than yourself. But when you're trusting an unregulated exchange, you're playing with fire. There's no question about it. And you can argue, well, I'm also playing with fire by keeping it on a cold wallet. You could, but if you take the appropriate means to secure your stack, and you live in a place that's not, war torn or random acts of ballistic missiles happen, then you should be pretty safe, as long as you keep your wallet in secure locations, in a secure location, however however you manage yours. Anyway, so think about what is Dixie, right? Dixie is the dollar index. Well, what does that mean? Well, it means that it's like a basket, okay, of about 5 other currencies that are weighed and measured against the value of the dollar, the purchasing power of the dollar. And so when you compare those 5 other assets, those 5 other fiat currencies against the US dollar, you get an index score. And that index score is the number, essentially, right? And that number is created by volatility, of course, right? Volatility determines the returns, determines the price action, etc. You could also say it's determined by entropy. That's also fine because volatility and entropy both have an impact, right? But yeah, you can easily say it's the volatility that creates the returns, that creates the price action, and that's the number that is the score, right, of the index. And that number shifts back and forth, as all asset values do, based on volatility and entropy and probabilities and statistics. And so it is no wonder that people like me, or maybe just me, say that Bitcoin is going to basically usurp Dixie, or be the real Dixie, because it will be the true measure of value of what the US dollar will be when most people are dealing in Satoshis. And you might think again, what are you talking about? There's no way we're going to have more than half the planet using Satoshis. Okay, maybe. But it still might be the thing that things are weighed and priced against globally at some point. You might not think so, but if it costs you 150,000 US dollars to go buy groceries, or 0.000001 Bitcoin to go buy groceries at some point, who knows, then what will you think then? What will be the price that you'll think of in your head? Will you think, oh, I need to pay $150,000? Will you be thinking, oh, I need to pay 0.000001 Bitcoins or whatever? Probably you'll be thinking the latter, and you'll think of that not as 0.0000 whatever Bitcoins, but you'll just think of it as the number of Satoshis. So I need, 10,000 Satoshis. I need 1,000 Satoshis. I need 100 Satoshis. Whatever it might be. Right? Remember, when you get to $100 million Bitcoin, each Satoshi is worth $1. When you get to more than that, a Satoshi is worth, less and less, right? Or, well, the dollar is worth less, so you get less Satoshis for that. So for example, if you get to, $1 billion, then each Satoshi is worth 10 cents. If you get to $10 billion, each Satoshi is worth a penny, right? Once that happens, if that would ever happen, then probably pennies would be done away with anyway by that time. But if for some weird reason they still exist, it would be very easy to envision Satoshi replacing penny in people's day-to-day speech, right? Even once it passes $1 per Satoshi, or gets to $1 per Satoshi, which seems like that's just never going to happen. $100 million per Bitcoin, what are you talking about? It could happen, though. And if it does happen, on the way there, we're likely to see people already starting to swap the word dollar or penny for Satoshis. Because there's going to be so much money in the Bitcoin system at that point that people will be thinking of Satoshis. And they'll be speaking about Satoshis. That's how they'll be managing their goods. So at that point, the Dixie will be probably measured by its purchasing power against Bitcoin. Or at the very least, they will add Bitcoin to the matrix of currencies that are traded against the dollar. By the way, don't just take my word for it. Look at the stablecoin scene. Look at what's happening with stablecoin. Do you know that Tether, the creator of USDT, the dollar stablecoin that existed, this existed now for what 10 years or so, something like that. Whenever it launched, 8 years, 10 years, something like that. That USDT is made by Tether, and Tether has now made a different stablecoin called USAT, and they've created it or launched it or whatever since the implementation of the Genius Act, which was a law instituted this past summer to foster stablecoins, to enable them to operate in a regulated manner. So, and there are many others, by the way, lining up. Yeah, Wyoming has launched a stablecoin called FRNT, like front or some weird acronym, FRNT. They launched that also this summer on the heels of the news of the Genius Act and all that. They became the first state in the United States to issue a stablecoin under, the Genius Act. And there are many other companies and stablecoin projects, some that already exist, like the PayPal stablecoin, which gets some kind of which has now legislation that covers it, and all the other stablecoins that exist that operate within U.S. borders are now governed by this Genius Act if they're complying with regulations and laws. Now, why does that matter? Well, it matters because it shows that there's more and more money going into the U.S. dollar market, because those are U.S. dollar regulated stablecoins. So they are regulated by U.S. authorities. Why does that matter? Well, it matters because it means that if people keep putting more money into U.S. dollar stablecoin equivalents, okay, in a way they're holding up the value of the U.S. dollar, even though it's a stable coin, right? You're not going to get $10 per dollar tomorrow. You're not going to be able to trade your dollars for $10, but you might make money shorting Bitcoin or longing Bitcoin against the dollar. So you're putting more money into the dollar system when you trade with those stable coins. And the long and short of that is very simply that you're helping the U.S. economy stay viable. You're helping the U.S. economy and the U.S. dollar remain a force. And it will remain a force thanks in part to exactly that kind of activity, and in part to the fact that the U.S. dollar is also maintained by the government and its arms and all of that, which of course are held up by the power of the U.S. dollar. So the power of the economy holds up the power of the military holds up the economy, and it's a circle, right? It's a self-sustaining circle, and that is one of the many reasons that we're likely to see the continuing increase in U.S. dollar stablecoins and their impact on the economy, as well as we're going to see more and more dollarization of Bitcoin and comparison over time, right, of like some kind of index between the Bitcoin and dollar purchasing powers, which again, I would not be surprised to see Bitcoin be included in the Dixie basket within the next like 40 years. I know that sounds like an infinity away, but Bitcoin's already, in its 16th year and growing and not looking like it's going to stop anytime soon. So that's, another 4 years and you're a third of the way, even more, to where it might become a fact that Bitcoin is one of the key assets that's measured against the dollar. Like, it could happen. Remember, the dollar has already lasted more than a century, and really, I want to be specific about it, more than 50 years already, since it went completely 100% fiat, not even gold paper, or not even paper gold is counted against it. It's just, the word of the government, right? Well, that's a very long time. Well, it may not seem like a long time, but in the world of fiat, 50 years is actually longer than the average fiat lasts. Right? The average fiat lasts around 27 years. So it has already more than doubled, or has basically doubled now, the lifespan of a typical fiat currency. And you could say, well, but the British have their coins and those last, the pound has been lasting for a few hundred years. Yeah, the British is a very unusual case. It is the one outlier that has outlasted its life expectancy by far, right? But that's because of the way their economy is and the way that their economy has been for the last more than a few hundred years. So it's a very unique and particular case. Okay. So there are reasons for that to have been the case. It helps that they're an island nation. It helps that they had a colonialist empire for much of that time. It helps that they withdrew from their colonies when they did. It helps that they adjusted things in their economy when they did, in the ways that they did, as hard as it was for people in those economies, or in that economy at different times, right? So the pound has gone through a lot. It hasn't just been easy street. And there are times when people thought maybe the pound is over, when, back when Britain was part of the EU, more than it is now. And obviously, because it withdrew from the EU, but it's still a trading partner and all that. But Great Britain, there was a time not long ago when people were considering doing away with the pound. Why? Because they wanted to take on the euro, because they were part of the European Union. And then some people in Britain said, hang on a second, we don't want to get rid of our pound. In fact, we don't want to be part of the European Union. So they had that whole Brexit thing. So the reason I tell you that is just to remind you that fiat currencies like the pound have very unique and special histories. Right? And that's why that one in particular has outlasted hundreds of years. None other has, by the way. You can't find another fiat currency of note that has lasted that long, right? Or that is alive today that has lasted that long, I should say, right? And so it's just literally the pound and the US dollar that are basically among the longest lasting currencies on earth, and that the dollar is as strong as it is even after all this time, and that the pound is as strong as it is after all this time is merely a factor of their particular contexts, which are very different than other fiat currencies. Which again, I mention to point out just the fact that the dollar is seeing its landscape and its reality change. And eventually, statistically, it will fall. It will go away, right? It will change. It will not be the same dollar that you use today. It will not be perceived in the same way. It will just not have the same meaning, right? It literally just end up being a collector's item, or it could change in a very drastic way that you don't perceive the dollar 100 years from now the same way you do today. Because it'll be working on a different mechanical system. Or it'll have different mechanics in place, I should say, fundamentally. It'll be a different thing. Because we can't just keep printing more and more fiat dollars with no consequences. If there's like 150 quadrillion dollars on Earth, okay, they're going to be pretty valueless. Hello from India, Bharat. Hello. Oh, thanks for the like, and hello to all. So the dollar will radically evolve in some way, shape, or form, and it'll probably happen within the next few decades. Yes, it may seem like that's a very long time, and you can say that in the span of life of a normal human, yeah, it's a long time. It could be like half a life or a third of a life for some people, maybe a bit less, maybe a bit more. But it is absolutely a short period of time in the history of the asset itself, considering it's already lasted more than 100 years and more than 50 years since we completely saw the dollar, since we saw the dollar completely go off the gold standard, where they did away even with paper gold, right? Like literally, what are people getting for their dollar? They're getting a promise from the Federal Reserve that this thing that they traded for a dollar, has a certain worth, etc. We're not actually getting, a dollar's worth of purchasing power for that dollar in the sense that it isn't a stable purchasing power. It continues to decline. So what costs you $1 today will cost you $1 and a penny tomorrow. Will cost you $1 and 2 pennies in 2 days. Will cost you $1 and a penny in 3 days, etc. Maybe it's not as rapid as a penny a day, although sometimes it is. But over time, right? Or what cost you $1 today will cost you $1.05 next year, or $1.07 next year, or maybe even $1.15 next year. And that we do see the general trend year on year of the purchasing power going down. If you haven't seen those charts where you see that purchasing power explicitly highlighted, right, where you see basically like almost a straight line down in terms of dollar purchasing power over time, well, I highly recommend you take a look at one of those charts because they are kind of staggering in what they display. As simple as it is, it shows you that the dollar is basically this dying thing, and it's very clear. Like, how much more can it go before it's just, you're getting nothing for it, right? Like, is the government going to give enough money to make sure that you can pay for $2,000 loaves of bread? Maybe it'll be $100,000 soon, just think about how crazy that is, right? And when you think, no, that'll never happen, when I was a lad, as some comedians have famously said, houses in America, for example, used to cost about, a couple of years of a person's salary, right? Depends on the house, but anywhere from like 6 months to 2 years, or even 4 years of a person's salary. That was the amount of money, and they would split that up over 20 years, make nice easy payments. It's like buying a car today, right? And like relatively cheap in the sense of like, yeah, you buy it for easy monthly payments of some low number, and you own a house. Nowadays, the average person getting out of university with a decent job cannot buy a house anywhere in America. Okay, yes, I know you can go to some cheap places and buy land or whatever, but with the job you're going to get local to that area, the probability of you being able to afford a house when you get out of college in 2025, 2026 is very low. Okay, you need to work many years to be able to afford the house. You need to pay a substantial down payment, far larger than ever had to be paid before. In some cases, it's up to 20%, even 40%. A down payment. If you don't have, if you don't have millions of dollars set aside in the bank, you ain't buying a house. Maybe, I know you can buy a house for less than that. Yeah, I know you can. But a lot of people envision getting a decent, family, comfortable home, the quote-unquote American dream, 4 or 5 comfortable big bedrooms, living room, big kitchen, all that stuff, big yard, maybe a swimming pool, maybe not, but, big land around their house, that kind of thing. where that might have cost you anywhere from a half a year to 4 years of your salary previously, nowadays it's literally costing you decades of your life salary on your salary. But unless you're making, at least six figures, you're going to be spending decades paying off your $1 million to $5 million home. And that's just a fact, right? Depending on the terms and the conditions and all that, you're going to be spending a lot of money on your home. Now, how can we ensure that the purchasing power of your assets don't collapse completely to the point where they're worth nothing over the next 30 years? And the answer is really very simple. There's a single thing you can do about it, right? And that's convert your assets that are losing money into assets that are losing less money or actually making money or growing in value. Well, how can you do that? Well, why is the dollar losing value? Because they keep printing more of it. There's an endless supply. And sure, there's a demand for it, but there's no shortage of supply. Which means because there's no fixed amount of dollars, because it's an open, endless amount, that even though there's a demand for it, the actual amount being printed and distributed to the banks that have all the money is imbalanced. Right? It's not balanced. It is imbalanced, and that imbalance is causing the weakening of the dollar over time. Of course, trade has a lot to do with it, and what people do with their dollars, etc. But it's only because there is this amazing and endless supply that just does not go away that it keeps losing its purchasing power. Well, you might think to yourself, but hang on, there's more people every year, so of course you need more dollars every year. Otherwise, how can everybody eat? Well, people could still eat even if there were fewer dollars around. It would just mean that the numbers on the prices of things would go down because the dollars would be more scarce. They would have more value. And since there are already quadrillions of dollars worth of wealth on the planet and many, many trillions of dollars printed or counted as money, it means that we already have a system that is saturated with dollars. The problem is not how many dollars there actually are. Yes, you could say, well, that has an effect on the price of goods. Of course it has an effect. But the problem isn't just the number of dollars that there are. The problem, right, is how they are held. Largely, they are centralized. They are held by large institutionals within the centralized power system. They are largely held by the wealthiest people and organizations and governments. They're not largely held by the average person. In fact, the average person has a small share of the total number of dollars. But, and I'd say this is a big fan of crypto and Bitcoin, in the case of Bitcoin, it's even worse. 95%. Right? Unlike the US dollar, which is like whatever, 80% or something like that of the money is held by the top 1% of the people. In the case of Bitcoin, it's like 95% held by the top 1% of people. and the other 5% is held by the remaining 99% of people, which means that Bitcoin has a very big distribution problem. Yes, it's decentralized. Yes, it's a cryptocurrency. Yes, it has all these wonderful things about it. But in fact, in terms of holdings, like who holds it, it is actually held by whales, which is another reason that the US dollar can continue to hold up just fine for a long time to come. Remember, the wealthiest people on the planet are already wealthy in dollar terms. Even if you think Michael Saylor doesn't care about US dollar power and all he cares about is Bitcoins, do you really think the guy doesn't have a few $1,000,000 in his bank? Like, he's a billionaire. Do you really think he doesn't have cash? No, he's got a lot of money. Okay, he's got a yacht, he's got a house, he's got things that are expensive to maintain. And he's a billionaire. So why would he not have a lot of money? Plus, it's reported that he has personally himself, and forget the fact that his company, MSTR, has more than 600,000 Bitcoins. He personally has, or did when it was last reported, has over 100,000 Bitcoin. And that was reported just a few months ago when Bitcoin was already well over $100,000, right? So if he has over 100,000 Bitcoins, you think he's not a massive multimillionaire already? No, this guy's a billionaire. Of course he has money. And yes, his money is in dollars, but it's also in other things, obviously. And yes, of course, he largely invests in Bitcoin, but he still holds those dollars. Why? Because his money comes from the fiat dollar world. That's his base of power. So he's not against that system which made him wealthy, even if he says he is, even if he says he's all about crypto. Listen, if the guy is all about Bitcoin, if he really believed that all you ever need is just to have some Bitcoin, why does he sell MSTR stock? You think about it. If he thinks that the stock market is just a fiat Ponzi, why does he sell stocks? Like, why does he allow people to buy a fiat Ponzi from him? What is he doing? Seems a little hypocritical to me. Seems like something you wouldn't do if you actually believed in Bitcoin and not in fiat stocks. Of course, we know that he buys Bitcoin with the money that he raises or that he gets from 0% loans, and then sells stock to that effect. And the game is on. So yes, he's able to buy more Bitcoins because people are buying more of his stock. But if he actually believed in Bitcoin and only Bitcoin and not in the stock market, then he wouldn't be running a sale on stocks. He would just be buying Bitcoin, right? But that's not what he does. He's buying Bitcoin with the power of the dollar and stocks and their purchasing power and their ability to raise money to buy Bitcoin. Which just shows that he's actually holding up the power of the dollar. Right? Like he's supporting the power of the dollar against Bitcoin. Right? So he might come off to you as a Bitcoin maxi, but think about what he actually is. Because he's actually sustaining the dollar. He's sustaining the dollar market. And by the way, I'm not against that. I'm just pointing out the fact that he is actually sustaining the US dollar in his very actions. By supporting the system that relies on the dollar. Anyway, so that's your little spiel. I hope that's been useful and informative and insightful to you about why Bitcoin will probably at some point usurp Dixie, or at least be weighed against it as the real Dixie index countermeasure. But it may not happen for a very long time. It may never happen, but whenever it does happen, you shouldn't be surprised if you understand what the Dixie is, what Bitcoin is, what they are in relation to each other, and how over time it could be the fact that Bitcoin can replace the dollar. And until then, it could be a leading agent weighed against it, and may even become the dominant or singular instrument weighed against it. Then it wouldn't be an index. I mean, it kind of would be. It'd be a unified index, but it wouldn't be a true index that takes an average of the leading counter assets. So maybe if you have Bitcoin, maybe you'll still have, you'll still weigh it against also with the GBP, the yen. Maybe they'll toss in Solana, who knows, or Ethereum or Cardano or something. But that is a very likely set of possible scenarios that we will see in the historical reshaping of the value of the US dollar over time. And where it will lead and where it will take us, only time will tell. Hope you've enjoyed this video. If you did, go on and like and follow or subscribe. Leave a comment and share it. I appreciate that. Let's get these messages out to more people. I know a lot of people in the crypto space tend to talk about different things. A few of them tend to talk about these kind of big topics that I address on the regular, which I do because I think it's important to keep an eye on the big topics, as well as the micro day-to-day sort of information about trading and markets and things like that, which are, still, yes, that's very important and interesting, especially if you're trading. But I think it's, in the bigger picture, more important to keep an eye on the big picture, right? And understand where this whole thing is going, because it lets you actually breathe, sit back, relax, enjoy the ride a lot more than if you're just worried about every micro moment, right? Yes, the micro moments may be fun and thrilling, especially if you make nice gains, but the bigger picture lets you understand, lets you really comprehend the true significance of the changes that the world is going through, that we're living through right now. Like, whether you like it or not, the probability is that Bitcoin will be around when your grandkids' grandkids are around, right? And that means they're going to look back on you and think, wow, you were there at the advent of when Bitcoin happened, and this is what you did, good or bad. They're going to think that's what you did with all that knowledge that was available to you on the internet and on YouTube. They won't even remember what YouTube was, but they'll know the name maybe from their history teachers. Once upon a time, children, there was a website called YouTube. What's a website? Exactly. And they'll learn about these things, and they'll think to themselves, wow, my great-great-great-great-grandpa or grandma was wise enough to see the massive changes underway with Bitcoin and crypto, and they made sure that our family would be stacked for generations. And for that, I'm eternally grateful. Or they'll think, geez, you knew all this stuff was happening, you didn't do a damn thing to change it. Or they'll think, man, caught a bad break. You had the opportunity, but you couldn't do anything about it because you had a hard time because of reasons, right? But at least they'll know you were here at the pioneering days, and what you did is what you did with all this potential, right? You are literally standing in the gap right now between greatness and failure over time. And the choice of where you go, for some people, it's not in their hands. I get that. There's some people who live with forces greater than themselves controlling their lives. That's just a reality. Not everyone has the opportunity to stack a whole bunch of Bitcoin right now. It's just not possible. A lot of people just can't do that. But there are people who are fortunate enough right now to be able to stack and are ignoring it because they think, I'll do that next year. I'll do that next year. I'll do that next year. Next year comes around, they didn't stack anything. and all of a sudden it's far more expensive than it was a year before, far more expensive than it was 2 years before, far more expensive than it was 3 years before, and so on. Gets to the point where, you know, they've waited now 16 years. Used to be free, now it's more than 100 grand a pop. How many billions of dollars would you be worth if you had mined Bitcoin when they were free and you managed to hold on to them all this time? Think about that. You'd be the one right now selling to Michael Saylor, right? When the prices are high, or rather when the returns are high, and you'd be buying the dip cheap, right? So if that's not you, if you weren't in the first group of miners and among the lucky ones who managed to hold on to their coins all this time, unlike those of us who had coins very early on and then they got smashed up with their computers, etc., right? And didn't regain all those coins or whatever. If you're any of the people who are not one of the very earliest OG holders that are still holding on, well then, you know, this is your time to essentially realize that you can still be relatively early to the game. You're not super early, but you're early enough, right? There's still only really like 1% of people on the planet who actually use Bitcoin regularly. Like have it in their account and use it for trading or whatever. It's still a small number, yeah. But that doesn't mean that it's a useless number. It's not. It's not a useless number. That 1% is very powerful. And they are increasingly gaining purchasing power as Bitcoin's value continues to rise over time. Right? Just think about that fact. Right? Bitcoin's purchasing power 10 years ago would have taken you a few hundred coins to buy a house. 5 years ago would have taken you like 40, 50 coins to buy a house. Now it would take you like a couple coins. Maybe even less, depends on the house you buy. But yeah. And it could easily be that another 5 years it'll take you, half a coin or a quarter coin to do that same transaction, right? Why? Well, because that's how the purchasing power works. So don't be surprised to see that continue over time. We're going to see the continuation of the power of purchase of Bitcoin, and we're going to see the continue of the degradation of the power of purchase of the dollar. Bottom line, that's why we have the situation we have, and hopefully that'll wrap it up for you. Hope this made it clear. Again, if you like this, by all means, be sure to like it and subscribe and follow and all that, whatever stuff. Leave a comment. By all means, leave a comment. Let me know what you think. Honestly, that's more important than anything else. Let me know what you think in the comments. I'm just curious to hear what you think about what I said. Do you think the power of the dollar will continue to slide over time, or will it have some miracle turnaround? Oh, look, a mushroom. You guys want to see a cool mushroom? Look at that. A mushroom. A Smurf house. I hope you can see that. A mushroom, Smurf house. Ta-da. Hello, mushroom Smurf house. Anyway, that'll do it for now, folks. Peace.